So thank you all for coming to our panel on foreign policy and demilitarization. We have 5 speakers that will be participating in our panel discussion, each addressing a distinct topic. First, we will start with Marcy Winograd. Marcy Winograd is a delegate for Bernie Sanders from the 24th Congressional District of California, which is on the Central Coast. She is an activist with the California Teachers Association, United Teachers of Los Angeles, and Jewish Voice for Peace. She also is a former candidate for Congress from the Coastal District of Los Angeles County. Marcy will be speaking about Joe Biden's choices for foreign policy advisors. Marcy, feel free to begin.
Marcy, you're going to have to unmute yourself. Oh,
that would help, yes. Thank you, Morris, for that introduction, Honey, for that reminder, and thank you all for being with us this evening. This is a critically important topic, and I appreciate the opportunity to address it. I was part of a foreign policy team with about 15 other delegates from California. We submitted a 10-page document with foreign policy recommendations, some of which were included in the final document, such as reducing the military budget. We wanted it to be reduced by at least 30%. There was no number pinned on that in the platform, but they did. The platform writers did allude to reducing the military budget. We urged that the funding for the Saudi war in Yemen, which is creating a humanitarian disaster in Yemen, be halted, and that is part of the platform. And we objected to the hawkish language that was in the 2016 platform that even went so far as to threaten war against Iran if it pursued a nuclear program. And that was removed, and they explicitly said, we will call off the race to war with Iran. Thank you. We had other recommendations, which I will share briefly. One was to declare a formal end to the war with North Korea. We still have never done that. And Korea Peace Now, we worked with that organization on those recommendations, and they urged us to submit that recommendation. We also said, bring the troops home from Iraq, Afghanistan. That is in the platform, and they talk about ending the forever wars, but they've been talking about that for a long time, and we've been in Afghanistan 2 decades, $2 trillion later. I'm not sure what we've accomplished. We asked that, of course, they rejoin, that Biden administration or the next administration rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, and that is in the platform. But we also wanted to push for the demilitarization of space and the dismantling of the Trump Space Force. That is not in there. In fact, there is an allusion to further militarization of space in the platform, although it's nuanced. We also pushed for the adoption of a no first strike nuclear policy. As Robert knows, we've been pushing for that for many years, and that is still not in the platform. So obviously there's work to be done, but it is incrementally better. Now, moving on to what we are looking at as we face the Biden-Harris ascension to the White House, and I think it's theirs to lose. I think they have the wind at their backs, though the latest CNN poll I was just reading shows that their lead is narrowing. Our foreign policy team, many of us signed on to a letter, open letter to Biden, which I can post in the chat. Please hire new foreign policy advisors. And what prompted this was a look at his lead foreign policy advisors, his lead team. And it was really quite unsettling, I'll use that word, to see that he has corporate lobbyists for military contractors who are in key positions and in line for possible cabinet posts as well. Hania, do we have the photographs?
I forwarded them to Lauren, but Lauren, I just sent you a group of photos, if you can please show them on the screen, and also some of our taglines that we've created for our foreign policy strategy team. Lauren, are you with us? I can share my screen, but you have to give me a moment.
Sure. Okay, give me a moment. So, for example, and then we'll see pictures of some of these characters. One of them is Michelle Flournoy. She is a top contender for the Secretary of Defense. She co-founded with another member of the Biden team Antony Blinken, they co-founded West Exec Advisors. Basically, these are strategic consultants. That's a fancy term, but they're lobbyists for military contractors. And they give advice to various governments on which contractors to use and so forth. Flournoy, as a co-founder of the Center for New American Security, CNAS as they call it, has been a vocal advocate for preparing the United States to conduct simultaneous large theater wars, to embrace preemptive strikes toward any country pursuing a nuclear program, to escalate troop deployments, US troop deployments to the South China Sea to conduct roving war games, to ensure that China does not threaten US assets there. This was an essay she wrote and was published in June of this year. My husband asked, well, when did she write that? Well, very recently. And there are other members of the Center for New American Security, CNAS, who advocate for the further militarization of space. One of my favorite quotes from Michelle Flournoy is, "In the future, war will come in many different flavors," right? So we want to make sure that she does not get a cabinet post. And in our letter, we object to her being even on the foreign policy team at all. We also have another member of the team, which is Avril Haines. Now, Avril Haines used to work for the CIA. Okay, that's Blink, but that's Blinken there. That's, keep going. One more. Nope.
We only have this group. I'm not
Okay,
seeing
that was her.
Okay, okay, I see.
Okay, I'm sorry, yeah. That's Avril Haines. She used to work for the CIA, and she's a controversial figure. She counseled, for want of a better verb right now, Obama on the drone lists. You know, she'd meet with him on a weekly basis to decide who would be targeted for drone operations. Some people have defended her, saying, well, she could have targeted more people. She also was involved, she supported Gina Haspel for CIA director. That was quite controversial because of Haspel's involvement with torture operations. And she was involved in redacting the Senate report on torture conducted by the Bush administration. So I don't think that Senator Feinstein is happy with her about that. Until recently, she worked with a company that was involved in digitally profiling immigrants for deportation. She worked with ICE to do that. Her company did. Next we have, let's see, Antony Blinken. He was one talking to Biden, I think, in that group picture. Yeah, there he is. So he was Biden's Senate foreign policy aide, and he crafted Biden's support for the Iraq invasion. I don't think we have a picture. Oh, there she is. That's Susan Rice. Yeah, she's talking to Kerry. Susan Rice, you know, she was a contender for the vice presidential nomination. And I think we're fortunate that she is not Biden's choice, that we're much better off with Kamala Harris, although there are concerns about her links to the Center for New American Security as well. Susan Rice has supported what she now contends was limited military intervention in Iraq. She repeated the Bush lies about weapons of mass destruction being hidden there. She also supported a military intervention in Libya. She and Flournoy and Hillary Clinton were the main advocates for that. They persuaded Obama to go in there. It ended up being disastrous, devolved into chaos. Critics say they created an arms pipeline for extremists throughout the Middle East. So Susan Rice would not be someone we would recommend for a cabinet position. There are plenty of other great candidates, and we'll get to those after the convention. So that's just a sneak preview of some of the people on the Biden foreign policy team. So as a result, and some of you, I don't want to forget Samantha Power. She's also on the list. And you see her with a man you may recognize. That's Henry Kissinger. She's receiving a prize from him. So that tells you something about her. Now, after we gathered signatures, we now have over 450 DNC delegate signatures on this open letter to Biden. Again, I'll post the link so you can read it. It's just for the DNC delegates right now, objecting to this team and urging Biden to move in another direction, as you might say. We had a story break on this in the Huffington Post, as well as the Washington Post, in which I was quoted using some rather strong language about Susan Rice, saying that she had supported every military intervention, leaving a trail of carnage in her wake. Should the presumptive nominee elevate her to the nomination for vice president or choose her for any cabinet post, it would be a death wish for the Democratic Party. And I do believe that. We have to move in a different direction. We have to demand that these people who have been wrong so many times in the past not be elevated to steer our foreign policy in the future. And certainly we do not want corporate lobbyists like Flournoy, who before being on the board of West Exec, she worked for the Boston Consulting Group, also a lobbyist for military contractors, and their contracts with the military contractors ballooned, I mean, by many millions while she was there. So what are we going to do about this? Well, we wrote our letter. We're going to continue to publicize that letter. And during the convention, we, a group of us, well, Hania namely, has created these Twitter tags with some input from me. And we're going to be tweeting them and posting them on Facebook. And we ask that you join us. If you're on Twitter, retweet us. I'm Marcy Winograd. I'm on Twitter at Marcy Winograd. Hania Jodette Barnes is on Twitter. And follow us. We'll follow you back. Retweet what we send. Share what we post on our Facebook pages. So for example, here's one.
Oh,
See the whole thing.
yeah, we went way too close. We're at the Pentagon at the moment. I will shrink the page.
We have grouped some of these war criminals together. Or so, shall we say, grouped some of the most objectionable foreign policy advisors together. Stop the drones, no Trump, no Haynes, no Pompeo, vote out the GOP. And I like this one in particular. Here we are, no Flournoy. So I urge you again in the chat, let me know, or you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook. And let's urge Biden and Harris, send them a message that for foreign policy, we want them to lead with diplomacy. We want a lifting of the sanctions against Iran. We want them to clearly delineate a schedule for bringing our troops home from Iraq, from Afghanistan, to stop these murderous drone strikes on several Middle Eastern countries, suspend the wall, the building of the wall right away, push for with demilitarization of our entire economy, of our military budget, now $700 billion, 53 cents of every discretionary dollar. It's criminal. And to recommit to joining the Iran nuclear deal, of course, the Paris Accord, and other accords. There are many accords that we need to join, and there's much to be done. One hopeful sign, I will say this, is that there is a DNC-related foreign policy webinar that's being offered this week. I don't know if you've seen that. I will post it on Slack and post it in the chat as well after I speak. And it's a couple of hours, and it features Biden's foreign policy director, who I'm not familiar with. She's not one of these. As well as Senator Patrick Murphy of Connecticut, a Democrat who has been an advocate for strict adherence to the War Powers Resolution. And I think he has himself expressed some frustration with the direction of the foreign policy team. So stay tuned and do support us and join in as we go forward. Thank you.
Yes?
And by the way,
Oh, please go ahead.
the mass, we also have mass, I'll put the link up. And it's, I think that one says, cut the military budget. And we have one that says defund war. And we urge you, when you're participating in the caucuses or any webinars, anything related to the DNC, to put in a good word for peace in the chat box, and that we want him to hire new foreign policy advisors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcy. And for any delegates who are watching this and who have not already signed on to the sign-on letter that Marcy just described to Joe Biden regarding his foreign policy advisors, you'll be in great company with over 450 other delegates in signing on. So please spread the word, sign it, share it, retweet Marcy's tweets on this topic. And Marcy actually brought us to a perfect transition to our next speaker by talking about the impact of sanctions. So Elahe Amani is an educator and administrator with CSU Fullerton. She's a trained mediator who works with the UN Mediators Beyond Borders and is the current chair of the Global Circles of Women's Intercultural Network. She has served as the facilitator of Days of Dialogue and Future of Policing, dialogue between communities and police across Los Angeles. She also speaks and has written extensively in English and Farsi on issues relating to human rights, peace, and gender issues. So without further ado, Elahe Amani.
Just to add really quick to that, Elahe Amani has been a mentor to both myself and Sudi Faroukhnia here. Elahe is also a peacemaker who works with Mediators Beyond Borders as the gender mediation trainer. It is a pleasure to have you here. Elahe, can you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you very much for your invitation to be part of this panel, and it's my honor to share this virtual microphone with other distinguished panelists. Thank you. Iran has been making headlines perhaps more than other countries for experiencing multiple overlapping crises. You may have heard about the couple of major floods, a train derailment, 2 buses crashing and killing most of the passengers, an earthquake not long ago, mass uprising in November that 230 people were killed and more than 7,000 people were detained, the crash of Ukrainian airline flight 752, that all the passengers, 176 passengers were killed and crew, in addition to the public health crisis of COVID-19 that took the lives of close to 20,000 people, to be exact, 19,639 people as of this week in Iran. What people in United States don't hear about, it's the reality of life of ordinary people in Iran under the devastation economic impact of the US maximum pressure sanctions campaign and the corruption of people in position of power in addition to the broad human rights violation in Iran. This is one big story from Iran that mostly missing the headline. The lived experience of Iranian people inside Iran for more than 4 decades is the story that often neither corporate media in US nor state-controlled media in Iran cover it. The objectives of the Iranian revolution, which many of us, including me, many men and women from my generation took part in it, was to mend the gap between rich and poor, combat poverty, corruption, and to bring democracy, respect for human rights, and sustainable economic development, not relied only on oil and political independence from the United States of America. However, more than 4 decades after revolution, the Iran Islamic Parliament Research Center recently, just last month, and put out a report called "The Poverty Line Income Needed by 4-Member Household in Iran has risen from 25 million to 45 million riyals monthly in the past 2 years, showing an 80% increase. This means, unquote, this means most of the ordinary workers and laborers do not even earn enough to reach the poverty line income they need to survive. The poverty line in 2010 in Tehran was about 10 million riyals, which slowly increased until 2017. And then spiked sharply as the national currency lost value and inflation jumped. Today, according to official Islamic Republic statistics, 70% of the 40 million working families live below the poverty line, and currently, as of August 7, 2020, there are 38 labor strikes simultaneously in Iran. Is the story of lived experience of Iranian people related to economic sanction? Definitely. But the corruption of people in position of power in Iran is the other side of the coin. Even high officials in Iran have linked poverty, homelessness, and other social ills to corruption. Hossein Raqfar, an economist and faculty of Tehran Al-Zahra University, has suggested that as little as 15% of Iran's economic problems can be attributed to sanction. Whether it's 15% or 50% of the dire economic situation of Iranian people linked to sanction, we are here to talk about foreign policy of United States and the impact of United States sanction on millions of Iranian people. The lifestyle of rich and famous in Iran has not been impacted, as their sons and daughters are studying at Ivy League schools in Canada and EU and even United States. And in Iran, they are still driving luxury cars and even pay $350 for one hamburger, according to the documentary of Labizon. Economic sanctions have quickly became a foreign policy tool of the choice for United States, while they are often portrayed as a kind of kinder, gentler option to war, they result in devastating impacts on the health and well-being of community. Iran is only the most recent example. The US number 45 president withdrew from Iran nuclear deal, which had proven to be effective. I wrote an article in English and Farsi about it. If you search it, you can read it. He then ramped up his maximum pressure campaign, imposing severe economic sanction on Iran. On January 8, number 45 president announced additional quote unquote punishing sanction on the Iranian government, framing it as a peaceful alternative to military action. But these sanctions are far from the escalation of this crisis. Economic sanctions are penalties imposed on commerce and financial relations and are usually intended to cut countries off the international relations and trade. They can restrict trade, commercial activity, or transaction with specific people or businesses. The US has applied more economic sanctions than any other country in the world. Sanctions have been imposed on Iraq, which I participated in the struggle against sanction against Iraq even. North Korea, Iran, Cuba, Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, among others. Sanctions are often framed as ways to put pressure on a state to change their behavior, but they are most often ineffective as a diplomatic tool. States rarely change their practices as a result of sanction, and political and military elites usually remain insulated. Ultimately, it's the most vulnerable communities that suffer the harmful effect. In the case of Iran, the Iranian people. Not only that, sanctions often lend power to repressive regimes who capitalize on people's suffering to cast themselves as liberators in the face of foreign oppression and to cement their own domestic support. Further, by isolating and impoverishing people, sanctions only weaken domestic social movements and limit people's ability to mobilize. In Iran, for example, sanctions are impacting the women's movement by increasing government repression, making it difficult for Iranian activists to connect with organizers across borders or seek international funding, and forcing people to shift their priority from movement building, because they accuse of people who are engaged in movement building as foreign agent, to meeting people's immediate need like food and fuel and housing. There is also evidence that economic sanction actually worsen human rights, making governments more likely to engage in political repression and torture, as we see in recent spike of human rights violations in Iran, particularly since last November uprising. The United States' previous round of sanctions, which prevented Iran from exporting oil and tightening restriction on the banking sector, not only partially forced Iran into a deeper recession and increased the cost of basic necessities like food and fuel, but also opened more favorable economic opportunities for China. This is not an issue that you see it making headline in US. In limited cases, sanctions can be effective and ethical, but only if they are a genuine demand of domestic social movements seeking rights and justice, as in the case of South Africa in 1980s, which at the time I was a student at Tehran University, part of a student movement, and we had many demonstrations which resulted in detention and arrest of many of the students, because Iran was the only country during the Shah that during the sanction on South Africa was selling South Africa oil. Today, sanctions against Iran do not meet these standards. Progressive social movements in Iran are not calling for sanction. In fact, they are opposed to their devastating humanitarian impact. The fact is that the United States sanctions endangers people's lives, particularly those already vulnerable in our society, women, children, and people living in poverty. In fact, research has shown that sanctions trigger similar devastation on communities as war. In the end, Iranian people have been oppressed economically and politically for the last 4 decades. The heart of society is beating for political change, but neither by war or military occupation, nor by sanction, as the burden of it is on the back of marginalized communities. Conflicts should be mediated in a fair and equitable negotiations. Iranian people need the solidarity of American people for democracy, social justice, and peace. As Arundhati Roy once said, another world is not only possible, she is on her way, and on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you.
Ella, thank you very much for giving us a very rich picture of what the impact of sanctions by the United States is on countries like Iran. And I urge people to keep the pressure not only on the Trump administration, but also on Joe Biden to pull back sanctions on all the countries that the United States is inflicting such heavy humanitarian harm. Our next speaker, again, kind of follows from the previous one, is Sam Hindy. Sam Hindy is a Bernie Sanders delegate and a DNC Credentials Committee member from San Mateo County. He is a current city council member and former mayor of the city of Foster City. He is a Democratic County Central Committee alternate in San Mateo. And he is the son of Palestinian refugees. So he will speak on issues affecting Palestinians and Israelis with respect to Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So please go ahead, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Farmars, for this introduction. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on when you are. Let me start by thanking the organizers for this weekend of action and excellent panels and conversations. I really also want to thank all the participants for giving their time to organize and to come in and be part of shaping our future together as progressives. Yeah, I want to start before I get into the Palestine and Israel issue. I want to start very quickly on our foreign policy as a frame and how has the United States foreign policy been operating over the last decades, actually, for quite some time. It's clearly our foreign policy has been relying mostly exclusively, not necessarily 100%, but for the most part on military action, regime change, and recently drone assassination and starting wars, which really leads us to know and to conclude that those who are shaping our foreign policy in Washington and lobbyists and strategists and consultants, they are really in the belief that the United States is the police of the world. And that is not true and should not be, because that is really against our special interest, our interest as American people. We are not the police of the world. And all these policies and all these actions, also, they are really counterproductive to us as the United States citizens. Our reputation overseas, when we start wars and we start regime changing, plummets. Not only that, it really fuels terrorism and anti-American sentiments. So instead, what do? Instead, really, we need to join the International Criminal Court and start seeking legal solutions to conflict rather than wars. This is a course of action, and this is what we progressive could start shaping these foreign policies by applying the pressure, by being part of having a seat on the table and putting these values that are important to us as US citizens and people who want to build future for our children and for this new generation that is coming up. We need to start promoting global cooperation and human rights rather than having wars and rather than spending all that money on wars and military. We need to start establishing equal partnership among nations to address really what is going to be impacting us as a nation, as a world together, the climate change crisis. This is where our effort, this is where our money needs to be spent, building alliances, building partnership with nations throughout the world to do this. And to also start addressing the human tragedies, whether it is, you have human tragedies such as famine, hunger, refugees. These are the things that the United States could lead. That's a true leader with the compassion. Currently, we are leading with a stick. We are leading with drones. We are leading with wars. We need to stop this. This has to really stop. And how does that start? How do we stop this, really? We need, our military budget is beyond ridiculous. Almost $1 billion is spent every year on our military budget. And we all know what is it that we're suffering here in the United States. We can't even have a Medicare for all. We cannot have a single payer healthcare system. Why? Because $700 billion is being spent on military budget. We don't have anywhere close to social equities. How many people in our communities in this country really they work, like Bernie Sanders said, they work 40 hours, and I could tell you they also work 60 hours and 70 hours, and they still cannot afford having a roof over their head. They cannot afford having Medicare. So this whole thing really has to change, and we see the impact of these policies, and I call them failed policies because they are failed policies. It's really counterproductive to the United States and to its citizens. So we need to change that. But let me jump in and pivot into the Israeli-Palestinian issue. As I have been introduced, I'm a son of Palestinian refugees. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon. My parents fled Palestine in 1948, and they fled to Lebanon and they became refugees as a result of the Palestinian Nakba. The Nakba is an Arabic word really, and it means catastrophe. And the reason the Palestinians call this a catastrophe, because during the 1948, the establishment of Israel, 700,000 Palestinians became refugees overnight. 700,000, and now there are millions and millions of them. So we have been working, I've been working with a great team of Palestinian American DNC delegates. We have been working extremely hard along with our allies, the Muslim American delegates, progressives, Jewish Voice for Peace, some here on the panel, Marcy and others, great allies and progressives who are calling for justice and calling for peace and calling for human rights for the Palestinians. But unfortunately, what we are doing seems to be contradictory to what the Democratic Party wants to do, or at least as reflected in the platform. They wouldn't even mention the word occupation. Occupation, they would not say, we're not inventing the word occupation. That is the reality on the ground, that Israel has been occupying the West Bank for over 53 years now. This is a fact on the ground, and this is a fact on the ground that is made possible by the US financial assistance. Israel could not sustain that occupation without the US financial assistance, and even without the US diplomatic cover in the United Nations, and other world stages. So they refuse to say the word occupation, and they continue to refuse it. And I said the other day, the word occupation is really ugly, because occupation is brutal, occupation is oppressive, but just avoiding to say the word occupation does not make it go away. So the Democratic leadership remind me of an ostrich, putting their head in the sand, and they think, oh, we don't see it, it's not there. That is not true. But the reason occupation and the word occupation was important for the American Palestinian delegates and its allies to have it in the platform, because in reality, the word occupation really does not describe the situation on the ground, what the Palestinians are going through. The reality is it's even worse than occupation. It is really colonialization of the Palestinians over the last 53 years. What I mean by when I say colonialization, because what's happening in Palestine, the West Bank now, really you have land confiscation at a scale that we have never seen before, which is by the Israel building this settlement enterprise. But how do they build the settlement enterprise? With financial assistance from the United States, number one. Number two, by ethnic cleansing the population, the Palestinians, from their land. They kick them out, land get confiscated, homes get demolished, and put them in a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller areas. I want to share with you probably just a little bit a map very quickly as to map of Palestine and the historic part of how Palestine maps changed over the years. So let me see if I could do that. No, okay.
Sam, can you share your screen with us? If not, you can send that to me and I can share it with our audience.
Yeah, I think I will do that in a little bit later. I don't know what I did, to be honest with you, but let me, okay, try to get out of here. Here we go. Okay, never mind. So what I was saying is how the situation has changed and how all the land is gone. So for those who are calling like the United States or the DNC platform, they were talking about having a two-state solution. Well, a two-state solution requires a contiguous Palestinian state to have a two-state solution. And that's, quite frankly, brothers and sisters, does not exist today due to the settlement construction that Israel has been pursuing for the past 53 years. What you have now is you have small cantons in the West Bank that are very small pieces, and there will be no independent viable Palestinian states in what is left of the West Bank. So that gotta that gotta change, and I don't know how that could change, which leads many observers and many people who are involved in this to really believe that the only available solution really now is one state solution. As much as the Democratic Party leadership does not want to see that happen, yet everything that they are doing and everything that Israel is doing is leading into that direction. So I don't understand where the logic is or where's the wisdom in such policies. But it is what it is. That's really what they're doing, and it's up to all of us to change that. What's important to note here really is these settlements are illegal under international law. And the United States, by aiding and abetting that settlement enterprise, we are complicit in violating international law, and that is nothing that we as progressive want to be part of. Not in our names do we want to see that is happening. So, you know, the Democratic Party really, for a long time now, they have been out of step with the Democratic voters and the base of the Democratic Party, and of course, needless to say, with the progressives. Just share with you a few polls that shows what I'm talking about. You have polls telling us that 71% of Democratic voters oppose Israel's annexation plan. And by the way, Israel was planning on annexing the Jordan Valley in the West Bank, and that was supposed to take place on July 1st. And thank you to every delegate and everyone on this call that had signed the petition. The petition was signed by more than 220 DNC delegates, conditioning military aid to Israel on them halting their annexation plan and stopping it completely. So thank you for everyone who stood by us and signed that petition. Currently, the United States is providing Israel with $38 billion over a 10-year period. I repeat that number because really let it sink. $38 billion of military aid assistance to Israel. And goes back to what I told you earlier. Israel could not accomplish what it's doing, depriving Palestinians from their human rights and self-determination without the assistance and the US being implicit into that. So that's where we are today. I think the only way this could change is by all of us, progressive, all of us who believe in human rights, all of us who believe in self-determination, because many in the Democratic Party believe in human rights, believe in self-determination, but unfortunately that does not apply when it comes to Palestine and the Palestinian. But us progressives, we have a different view of the world. What we believe human rights apply to each and everyone, including Palestinians. So we will continue to do that. Thank you, Hania, for the map. We will continue to do that and continue to struggle. And this is something we're not gonna give up. Actually, we are building the momentum. We are building the alliances. Thanks to all of you for being on our side. In the news lately, last week, or this week earlier, there was talk about United Arab Emirates and Israel having a treaty, which was supposed to be, or being addressed by the Trump and United Arab Emirates leaders, Israel, and even Joe Biden, unfortunately, as a step in a great direction for peace. There is no peace if there is no justice. There is no peace at the expense of the Palestinian people's right. What has happened in this treaty, so-called treaty, really the United Arab Emirates and Israel have had this relationship for many years now, but it has just not been in the open. What has changed in this announcement is being it open, and I see it, and some people also see it, that it's simply a stunt to give Trump a dose in the election, that he has achieved something on the international stage and on the foreign policy front. But really there is nothing substantial that has changed. And this, make no mistake about it, this will not advance the cause of peace by one iota, zero, zilch, none, none. So I'll stop here. I think I reached my 10 minutes limit, and I'll pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you so much for listening.
And of course, we're gonna ask that all speakers stay online because we're gonna have Q&A, and I'm sure everyone is gonna be very interested to ask you questions. John?
Thank you, thank you, thank you very much for your talk, Sam. And I, just really honored to be here with this amazing panel. And our next speaker is Ben Norton. He is a journalist, writer, filmmaker, and musician. His journalistic work focuses primarily on U.S. foreign policy, war, national security, and media criticism. He's the assistant editor of the investigative journalism site, The Gray Zone, and he produces the political podcast and video show, Moderate Rebels. He is also a contributor to the media watchdog, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR. Ben will speak on recent US-backed coup attempts in Latin America. Ben, please go ahead.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for organizing this. It's really important, especially in the US progressive community, because unfortunately, as I'm sure many of you all, lament on a daily basis, when it comes to a lot of people on the US left, the issues of empire, foreign policy, what's called foreign policy is often, low on the list of issues. So I think we really need to prioritize this. I personally think it's probably the most important fundamental contradiction in US politics, and we need to fundamentally organize all of our political actions against empire, against imperialism. And in Latin America, where I've been living, of course, I'm a US citizen, but I actually moved to Nicaragua. And before the end of the world with coronavirus, I was going back and forth. But here in Nicaragua, people are, the effects of imperialism are felt very heavily. And last year, I also spent about half of the year in Venezuela. And earlier, some of the panelists spoke about the effects of sanctions and specifically on Iran. And the situation here is very similar. The sanctions policy by the US government is portrayed by leaders of the Democratic Party, by so-called human rights organizations as an alternative to war. We really need to resist that framing. It is not an alternative. Sanctions are another form of war. There is conventional military war, which kills civilians through missiles, and then there are sanctions, which kill just as many, if not more, civilians through starvation, through preventing a country from being able to buy medical equipment and medicine. We have seen during the coronavirus pandemic, the US government under Trump has really accelerated this policy, even while people are dying of a horrific disease, a horrific virus rather. The US government is preventing countries, Iran, Venezuela, and other countries from importing medical equipment and medicine. So this needs to really be at the forefront of our organizing. And here in Nicaragua, this is another country that is being targeted with the same set of policies. There really is a strategy that Washington, that both parties have drafted and that they use against countries that are demonized as authoritarian, where corporate media outlets tell us that we need to fear these countries because in the case of Iran, supposedly it's a threat. None of these countries have ever attacked the US. It's absolutely preposterous. And we need to understand that this framing that these countries are supposedly a threat is unfortunately bipartisan. It was actually the Obama administration that before Trump even came in, Obama himself passed an executive order saying that Venezuela represented an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. And then Trump also has done that with Nicaragua. So according to Obama and Trump, Venezuela and Nicaragua are extraordinary threats to the national security of civilians living in the US. It's absolutely preposterous. Why did they do that? Because if they pass an executive order saying that these countries are supposed threats, then the president can pass any legislation effectively without the stamp of approval from Congress. So that is used to push aggressive sanctions, that is used to justify forms of military intervention that are indirect. We have seen in the case of Venezuela that the Trump administration has already organized several attempted invasions We saw one this past May that it was a total disaster. You know, people jokingly called it the Bay of Piglets, but it was still an attempted invasion on the part of the US government and the government of Colombia, which has a far-right regime. So we need to understand that there's also a hybrid war being waged. There's not even just the sanctions, which are brutal. The sanctions have really crippled the Venezuelan economy, fueling an economic crisis, fueling hyperinflation, resulting in a lack of goods. And if it weren't for the Venezuelan government's policy of providing food boxes to 80% of the population, of providing free medical care and other basic services, if it weren't for those services, even more Venezuelans would be dying. But as of right now, scholars estimate that at the very least, at least 40,000 Venezuelan civilians have died because of the US economic blockade, which again began under Obama and is only continued under Trump. And I should stress that unfortunately, Joe Biden's campaign has made it very clear that Biden would actually continue basically all of the same policies of Trump vis-a-vis Venezuela. The Biden campaign held an event on Latin America in July, and he said that really the only difference under a Biden administration would be TPS. And of course, that's a good policy. We should support immigrants and refugees coming from countries all around the world. But the thing is, the Democratic Party's policy, the only difference is that they still support destroying the country and creating a refugee crisis. They just want to take the refugees and migrants, whereas Trump's policy is destroying the country and then kicking out the refugees and immigrants. So we really need to make that a priority. And then finally, I mentioned that we need to understand that the sanctions policy are part of what I refer to as hybrid warfare. We have to understand that as anti-war activists and advocates and journalists and organizers, we have to understand that the nature of war has shifted. You know, the nature of our social interaction has shifted. I'm talking to you all on the internet, right? So it only makes sense that other things in society would have shifted. And war is one of them. These days, it's very difficult for the US government to wage a conventional military war. I mean, it still is in Afghanistan, in Syria, and all across the African continent. There still are boots on the ground, but it's mostly done silently, right? So in the case of AFRICOM, we now know that more than half of the countries in the African continent have US boots on the ground, special operations forces, and they're carrying out hundreds of combat missions every year, and we hear nothing about it. So the nature of war is changing because the more that these wars are reported on in the media, to the very little extent that they are reported, they're very unpopular. So what that means is that the US has carried out new forms of warfare, drone war, of course. So instead of having boots on the ground, the US can bomb people without actually having troops in the country. Cyber war is becoming much more prominent. Iran was mentioned. The US has been carrying out many acts of cyber war, targeting Iranian infrastructure, also targeting Russia, targeting Venezuela. It's very likely that there have been a few blackouts in Venezuela. It's very likely that those were caused by US cyber attacks. And then, of course, economic war. And then there's psychological war through fake news, disinformation. So we have to understand that according to the US Army's own manual on unconventional warfare, which was published by WikiLeaks, and of course I should mention that the publisher of WikiLeaks is being tortured in a British prison, and the US is trying to throw him in prison for the rest of his life because he exposed these kinds of US crimes. And WikiLeaks released this very secretive Army manual on unconventional warfare, and it details all of the other forms of warfare that the US is waging. And right now, more than a quarter of the global population, more than 2 billion people, are living in countries that are suffering from sanctions due to the US government, especially countries that have progressive governments. So finally, my last note I'll say is getting back to Latin America here. The Trump administration under former National Security Advisor John Bolton demonized the only remaining socialist governments in Latin America as the troika of tyranny, which is absolutely incredible because the US is backing some of the most brutal right-wing authoritarian regimes in the region. Brazil has a fascistic government under probably one of the most far-right leaders on the planet. He makes Trump even look more moderate, Jair Bolsonaro. Also, the US government is backing a very brutal repressive regime in Ecuador. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I was talking about forms of unconventional warfare and coup attempts. The circumstances here are very dire because people see the consequences if the US can actually succeed in carrying out these coups. And we see that right now in Bolivia. Bolivia right now, the people of Bolivia are suffering under a horrific military regime that was installed after a coup last November that was totally backed to the hilt by the US government. And unfortunately, many Democrats also supported the coup against the president Evo Morales, who was democratically elected. And we now see that the coup regime is brutalizing mostly indigenous protesters. They've killed dozens of people. They've disappeared hundreds of people, and they're systematically trying to purge the left-wing indigenous majority party of Evo Morales. They've delayed the election 3 times. People across Latin America look to Bolivia, and they see that if the US has its way with their countries, that is what their future will look like, a military dictatorship, much like the bipartisan military dictatorships supported throughout the Cold War in the 60s and 70s across Latin America. So Latin America, unfortunately, is, when it comes to the issue of US imperialism, it's really the worst example of the most egregious crimes. And we've seen that the Trump administration has been invoking the Monroe Doctrine. But we can't pretend like this is just a policy that began with Trump. The Monroe Doctrine goes back 200 years to the 1830s. And unfortunately, for 200 years, presidents from both major parties have seen, and not just presidents, but members of Congress, have seen Latin America as their imperial backyard. So this really needs to be more of the conversation, because unfortunately, the Democrats, they'll say that they support refugees and immigrants from Central America, but they never interrogate the fact, why are there so many refugees from Central America? It's because the US government, under both Republicans and Democrats, has been overthrowing progressive governments across the region. Let's not forget that it was under Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's State Department that in 2009 overthrew the democratically elected government in Honduras, which wasn't even a socialist government. It was a left-leaning nationalist government. And that unleashed one of the worst refugee crises in the region in Honduras. So we really need to link these US policies abroad to the domestic policies when it comes to refugees, when it comes to immigration. And we really need to hold Democrats' feet to the fire and say that, look, if you do want to put your money where your mouth is and you say that you oppose Trump's attack on immigrants, well, we should also oppose the imperial attack on immigrants. We should stop destabilizing entire countries and creating refugee crises. And Latin America, unfortunately, along with the Middle East, are an example of how these policies that have gone on for decades have very much continued. And if we don't hold these Democrats to accountable, and if Biden does manage to win, unfortunately, I'm afraid that I think that Biden would continue basically all of the same policies that we're seeing Trump carry out right now.
Ben, thank you very much for giving a great overview of what has been happening with US foreign policy in Latin America. And it's just really appalling to me to see Joe Biden competing with Trump to see who can be tougher on governments that the US opposes in Latin America. And to see even Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, that Marcy Winograd earlier mentioned, criticize Trump for not being effective enough in overthrowing the government of Venezuela.
That's exactly right. And I didn't even mention, unfortunately, that Biden has an ad, well, his campaign at least has an ad in Florida right now that compares Trump to left-wing leaders of Latin America. The ad, first of all, it doesn't understand the concept of the caudillo, which is ridiculous anyway, but it refers to, it lumps Trump, Hugo Chavez, and Fidel Castro together as if they're somehow similar. So unfortunately, when it comes to some issues, especially Latin America, the Biden campaign is in some ways is actually campaigning to the right of Trump on these issues. It's really pitiful, and we really need to pressure so-called progressives on this, because they're running to the objectively running to the right of a fascistic far-right leader.
And that's truly the most scary part of this, and that's why we really appreciate your joining this call. The one other thing that you brought up just really blew my mind is that the Biden campaign is talking about allowing TPS, temporary protective status, for wealthy Venezuelan exiles, but the Biden administration, Obama-Biden administration, refused to give TPS to the victims of the Honduras coup that happened under the Obama-Biden administration. So, you know, low-income Central American refugees didn't get support. High-income, mostly white Venezuelan elites leaving, they can have TPS. It just, as an immigrant rights activist, that really bothers me. But thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Our final speaker here is Robert M. Nelson. He is a delegate alternate for Bernie Sanders from the 27th Congressional District of California in the San Gabriel Valley. He is a NASA astrophysicist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He was a member of the NASA Voyager and Cassini-Saturn orbiter science teams, and he has 5 decades of experience in the scientific community's efforts to educate the public about the danger of nuclear war. Bobby will talk about disarmament, specifically nuclear disarmament, and the risk of nuclear war. Bobby?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel. I'm going to take this discussion a little different direction, which I hope you'll find intellectually intriguing, because part of the best part about making revolution is what you learn yourself, and I'm hoping that we can all learn a few things of looking at things from a different perspective. At one point in my career, I was NASA's chief scientist for all new developing technology. And the direction that I want to take this conversation is the issue of who drives what, the chicken or the egg. Does technology drive policy, or does policy drive technology? So I'm going to say a few words, and then I hope that you'll find this stimulating. Let me start by going back a little bit in time, and also set some issues involving the what will evolve to the current policy problems or analysis. Back in the 13th century, the great Russian hero Alexander Nevsky repulsed invading Swedish and Teutonic armies at the Neva River and became a Russian national hero. He then cut a deal with invading Mongols from the other direction, and that ensured the stability and evolution of modern Russia. The weapons available to Alexander Nevsky's army and his people who challenged them were essentially bows and arrows and metal armor. The battle methods that they used were culminated on a famous battle you can Google on. It's called the Battle of the Ice. It occurred in 1242. The technologies that they had available to them were just evolving. These included some new ideas, projection of force at a distance. Particularly, these were enabled by chemical explosive black powder. Over the next few centuries, guns and cannon were being developed, and a whole professional class of bomb builders evolved. Let me give you an example of someone 3 centuries later, a bomb builder comes to a lord with a resume, and he's got 7 or 8 preceding things about what he'll do. He'll build bridges, and he'll build tanks, and he'll build ships, etc. But when you get to number 8, he culminates his list, and he says, "In case of need, I will make big guns, mortars, and light ordnance of fine and useful forms out of the common type." Number 9, where the operation of bombardment might fail, I would contrive catapults, mangonels, turbacci, and other machines of marvelous efficacy and are not commonly in use. And in short, according to a variety of cases, I can contrive various and endless means of offense and defense. Then it's sort of his throwaway items 9 and 10. He says, "In times of peace, I believe I can give perfect satisfaction to the equal of any other in architecture, and the architecture and the composition of buildings, public and private, and in guiding water from one place to another. And his sort of throwaway item was, and also I can carry out sculpture in marble, bronze, clay, and I also could do painting, whatever may be done, as well as any other, be he who he may. In case you haven't guessed it, that's the resume of Leonardo da Vinci. And people who do those kinds of, what I'm trying to drive at here is the technology drivers, the bomb builders have always been with us. They're always moving in these directions and always providing society with new ways to make war. And this is the problem now, is some of these new techniques that are opened up and how we make war and how we try to, with the challenges to us as to how we prevent war. In the next 400 years since Leonardo da Vinci, war was perfected by advancing the concepts of forced propulsion at a distance to the highest levels of perfection. The cannons and gunpowder allowed tremendous amounts of material to be moved great distances, and it culminated really and reached its peak during the period of World War II. And I want to give you some numbers of how rapidly things have changed. Think about how fast, how many times, how much changes there were between the time of Alexander Nevsky and World War II, and World War II and now. In World War II, we perfected the biggest chemical weapon available, the high-capacity Mark I bomb, known as the blockbuster. It had 2 tons of TNT. It could destroy a city block. It was a detonating weapon, although energy was released instantly. Concurrently, we perfected the incendiary bomb. This delayed the release of energy over time, and it was most categorized in the form of napalm, about a ton of napalm. It was responsible for the fire bombings of Dresden, Hamburg, and Tokyo, 2 issues that still linger as to the effects of war, and particularly on civilian populations. In 1945, the great new technical development was the atomic bomb. We had, in World War II, the biggest bombs, 2 tons of TNT and a blockbuster, a ton of TNT, a ton of chemical explosive and napalm. Suddenly we had the atomic bomb. Hiroshima had 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent. That is a dramatic and profound issue. In 1945, in 1952, Operation Mike, we detonated the first thermonuclear weapon, 15 million tons of TNT. It's said in science that if you make a 2 order of magnitude improvement, you rewrite the rules of all force projection. The modern nuclear weapons are 15 orders of magnitude larger than the ones used in World War II or by Alexander Nevsky. The issues that we have to contend with as we think about war are characterized by we've known these for years, the effects of nuclear weapons. A 1 megaton nuclear weapon, a fairly common one found in the arsenals of 7 countries now, that will bring an immediate death for 50% of the population out to a radius of 3 kilometers. It'll bring thermal death to people, 3rd-degree burns on exposed human skin out to 10 kilometers. And 50% of the remaining energy emerges as a plume, which will send 30 kilometers down, causing radiation sickness. That sets a very formidable challenge to anyone who wants to contemplate any reasonable use of nuclear weapons in any conflict situation. At the same, concurrently with the evolution of the energy in the weapons, we have the evolution of the delivery systems. In 1942, the Enola Gay delivered the first nuclear weapon. It was not designed to deliver nuclear weapons. It flew at 600 miles an hour. It had 4 gasoline piston engines. In 1946, we developed our first aircraft to deliver nuclear weapons across the ocean, 19,000 kilometers in range. It was called the B-36. It was the largest mass-produced aircraft ever built. In 1952, we developed the B-47. It flew faster than the B-36, but it had a much shorter range. Here, technology was driving policy. The B-36 was supposed to take off from Florida, drop a nuclear weapon on the Soviet Union, and return and land at a safe landing at a base in Spain. And by 1947, by the B-47 in 1952, the idea was put the bombs on the planes, keep them in the air 24/7, and have them be ready to go and penetrate. By 1955, we had the B-52 Stratofortress. That had 8 jet engines and it had a range of 17,000 kilometers. But then something else happened dramatically in technology. In 1956, just a year after the B-52 was placed into operation, Sputnik happened and introduced the era of space-based surveillance, and now a whole different way in which technology was driving policy emerged. This had a profound setting for where the technology issues and foreign policy and weapons policy have evolved today. In 1962, the United States had Jupiter-C missiles in Turkey. The Soviet Union positioned SS-4 and SS-5 missiles in Cuba, and the Cuban Missile Crisis evolved. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed just about everything. It's caused, going right to the brink of war, these missiles each had a time from launch to target, 20 minutes or so, and the world stood at the edge. And the important part that we need to know from this is that there was a deal, and we were never told this when I was a child. We weren't told this until only recently, that there was a deal cut. The Soviets never did just cut and run from Cuba and pull the missiles out. The arrangement was the SS-4s and the SS-5s left Cuba, and the Jupiter-Cs left Turkey. But that was the first part of a successful, very delicate international negotiation. And something that's very important for us to remember. There were a series of events that followed that, which we need to remember as part of a productive, well-negotiated series of events and international relations in negotiating treaties. In 1963, we negotiated the Atmospheric Test Bands Treaty.
Robert, I do apologize. We are a bit short in time, and we do want to open it up.
Right now, I'm sorry.
No, you are a world and wealth of knowledge, and we could spend hours with you discussing these important issues, but we do want to open it up.
I had timed this out for about 15 minutes, and I thought that's what we agreed to.
Okay. Well, it is 10 minutes for all of our speakers to speak. So we do want to open it up for question and answer with our audience members. Farahmaz, if you'd like to lead on that, please.
Yes, so I see Sharon has raised her hand, and if anyone else would like to speak, please raise your hand. Sharon, go ahead.
Hi, yes, hi, I'm a delegate for Bernie Sanders, and I just introduced a resolution to curtail US military activity because of climate change. And I'd like to get your opinion on, I don't hear people talking about that, but we really should be talking about that a lot and leveraging that. And how do you see the Green New Deal playing into curtailing military jobs?
And are you directing your question to a specific panelist or just to all the panelists?
No, all panelists. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So if any of the panelists want to unmute themselves and speak on this question.
I will speak if you'd like. Sharon, thank you for bringing that up. I agree that is the primary threat. It's an existential threat. And that is folded into the letter to Biden, both the letter from DNC delegates and even more so the letter from non-delegates, authors, scholars, former analysts. And there was some discussion earlier during one of the other panels about the military and could the military be used to fight climate catastrophe? Is that what we should be, is that the direction we should be pushing? Because that is a national security threat, or is that just kind of a hopeless pursuit? So I don't know, what do you think, Sharon? You can unmute Sharon. Sharon, can you unmute yourself?
Now I can, yeah. Yeah, well, thanks for asking. You know, I just know that things change. And I know that once it hits that groundswell of support that pushes things over the edge, things do change. So I don't know how close we are to that right now, but I'm going to keep promoting a Green New Deal because the way I see it, we really can't separate military jobs from fossil fuel jobs. So we need just transition programs for both. Because every state is so stuck with all of these military jobs and defense industry jobs that everybody, all the politicians are completely, you know, their hands are tied because they can't say, well, we're getting rid of all these jobs. So we need to help them.
Thank you. We have Cheng Sim, Alexander, and Todd Jones in the stack. Cheng Sim, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you, Sudhi. I don't actually have a question, but I just have half-formed thoughts that I'd like to share and see what people think. All these panels this weekend have been really informative, and listening to this panel in particular, you know, it's imperialism, U.S. imperialism, structures that we're living in, you know, have been, they were in a way set, the current formation was set, you know, post World War II. And the hotspots may change from time to time, but essentially the power structures remain the same. And I wonder, you know, our usual tactics of, like somebody said, a number of you actually said, a number of panelists said, you know, we view U.S. empire and the actions of U.S. imperialism as foreign policy. So the domestic population, you know, doesn't see foreign policy as connected to them, to domestic policy. And we, you know, and every time we, you know, we protest against the war, but we don't connect it back to us. And, you know, the people's budget panel discussion earlier made me think that, you know, because they're talking about people's budget and linking defund the police with funding social needs. Why can't we do the same here with foreign policy and demilitarization? Defund the military, fund the Green New Deal, fund the Medicare for all. Our demands need, so with the Biden administration, you know, day after, hopefully, you know, we get rid of Trump, we need to, instead of begging him, like, you know, Marcy, I applaud what you're doing, but I think begging the administration to have more enlightened people, I don't think it's gonna get us very far. I think we need to put our energies into making what Achilles said at the single payer panel discussion on Saturday. We need to make certain clear critical demands, and we need to agitate around them. So what are those demands that we need to make? We need to link foreign policy, US imperialism, with domestic priorities. So the demands we need to make in a Biden administration now is not, we need Green New Deal here, we need Medicare for all here, we need demilitarization here. No, it has to be linked. It has to be demilitarized, cut the military budget, and put that money into Medicare for all, Green New Deal. Even though we know that, you know, the money is already there for Medicare for all, but we need to make those critical demands. Make that demand, make those demands linked, so we can't separate them from each other. Those are my unformed thoughts after listening to so many people over this weekend. And I'm wondering what people think.
Thanks, Cheng Sim. Do you have a specific person that you want to ask that question from?
No, I just want to.
General. Anyone on the panel who would like to address that? Any actions, specific actions on how we can link all our demands? Or
I can
I just wanna say
respond.
that go ahead.
Oh, you can go.
No, you go
ahead,
first.
Mark.
Sorry.
I can respond to it. You know, as far as I know, for the last perhaps 50 years, peace activists have always translated this much military expenditure can translate to this many new jobs. This is well-being of, I mean, they have made that. I think we need to go beyond it and find creative way to make it happen. Yes, we do need that. If military budget is cut, which it should be cut, it can even benefit not only people in United States, people globally, but unfortunately, we need strategies, we need tactics go beyond this translation of this many military budget. And so creating campaigns and movement around this issue, I think that is where we need to put our energy and effort.
If I may add to that. If I may add to that, I think that's, it really leads us back to the crux of the problem, in my view, which is money in politics. So as long as you continue to get money involved and special interest money, choosing who are the people who are making decisions, it's still going to be for special interests. It's still going to be for the military industry compound. It's still going to be for wars. It's still going to be for that. And all that money, like we said, you have $700 billion in the budget taken away from domestic issues, Medicare for all, it's taken away from education, it's taken away from all those things. So this has to really start with taking money out of politics and continue to put progressives in office. We need more people on the table, and we need to reform the system. I think it's really critical to take money out of politics.
Yeah, I'd like to respond. I was going to say, I agree with defund military or divest from militarism, and I would love to see that linked with defund the police, ag demonstrations. I think they are not separate. They need to be linked, connected, and we need to show the connections in very clearly. I hesitate to make it just an economic issue, because militarism, the cost is not just economic, right? The cost is in human suffering. It's in oppression. So I think to talk just in terms of economics is not fair to all the people we have harmed and will harm if we continue.
Thank you, Marcy. Next we have Alexander.
Thank you. Yeah, so the connection between militarism and climate emergency is, the climate emergency is a direct result of imperialism. The planet is dying. It will probably be effectively dead within 20 years. And the first thing we need is education. People have to understand this process has been going on for up to 6,000 years, basically white supremacy. And the forces we're confronting are unthinkably immense because of these trillions of dollars we've shoveled to them. $40 trillion, so the CIA can blackmail our politicians, can brainwash them, can conduct psyops on the American people, can disrupt progressive organizations. You know, my view is we have to have something like a revolution to not die very soon, which means we have to organize our own elections, not allow the power structures to organize them, create bioregional councils, and recognize the enemy, visualize the enemy, the path of death. And now with industrial society, you know, I'll just say it bluntly, you know, the conservative with the F-150 that just extra blasts, this is a death cult. It's an industrial civilization death cult. It can only last a couple hundred years. And so we have to recognize this path of death versus path of life, sustainability,
I'm sorry, Alex,
society.
is there a question, because we're kind of short in time and we have a couple other people, is there a specific question that you have for one of the panelists?
This is, I'm actually having the audacity to answer the question, what is the connection between climate change and militarism?
Thank you.
And I'll yield my time, thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it. Next we have Todd Jones.
Hi. Yeah, my question is for Bobby Nelson. And I wanted to congratulate him on his backdrop. It's a picture that I recognize. It's actually a picture that I took of the moon Io at Jupiter 26 years ago. And he would know that's true. My question for Bobby is, you've been thinking about how to avoid nuclear holocaust in Earth for many years, decades. And so I'm sure you have a lot of ideas and on how to go about it. What's your best advice at this time? That's it.
Thank you, Todd. I think the problem we're facing is that we have a series of established treaties, all of which have been scuttled by well, they were allowed to expire by some of the previous administrations, but were certainly being renegotiated with some good faith. But all of the treaties now are on the line. So all of this list of treaties that I started reading to, starting from the 1963 Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty to the 1996 Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, all of them are about to be abrogated by the United States. So we're back to square one. And it has to do with establishing ways to have relationships with the former Soviet Union, and particularly in light of a whole new class of weapon systems, these hypersonic delivery systems, which are far more complex to figure out and use than ballistic missiles. And a treaty needs to be negotiated about that, perhaps almost everything else. A treaty needs to be negotiated about that, foremost among all of the other technical issues involving advanced technology and nuclear weapons. So that's what I would suggest, is that we focus on that, because these are very destabilizing, because they create the possibility of someone convincing themselves they actually could launch a first strike and get away with it. Thanks for the question.
So what we've got is, we've got this Russiagate situation that makes everyone want to start a war with Russia. We've got to stop that.
Yeah, but that requires a whole rethinking of how we approach our attitudes toward Russia. Consider that Catherine the Great annexed the Ukraine in 1778. 50 years later, the United States annexed Texas, California, New Mexico, and Arizona. So what's the issue when we start waxing righteous about the Russia and the Ukraine? There remains the so-called defensive Europe in the post-Soviet era. What is NATO for? And issues and understandings of what a new Europe looks like, particularly the delivery of energy supplies to Western Europe and the provocations over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
So basically diplomacy has gone off the rails. We've got to get it back on track.
Well, and I think Biden deserves as much criticism as Trump on that, because the idea of putting Hunter Biden on that Ukraine gas board was obvious that it was just a way that the Ukrainians were trying to bribe Biden to do something which they've been circumventing, which was trying to steal gas from the pipelines that had traditionally gone from Russia through Ukraine to Western Europe. That's what the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline is all about. They decided to circumvent the new government in the Ukraine and bypass them. So I think that we've got a real bad problem, and that all of these previously worked out understandings are now thrown to the winds. The new administration is going to require a particularly careful foreign policy team, of which I think Marcy has already said we have some severe reservations about. We're going to have to watch that cabinet that's coming in right and left, because they're going to be a big problem.
I agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Samia?
Hello, everybody. I have a comment kind of for Sam, and then a question for Ben. Thank you for expressing much of the frustration and the narrative of the Palestinian community. I should say that I noticed one of the comments said that we should try to defund or to stop the BDS, the boycott campaign. And I need to remind some of our friends here that the reality on the ground is what occupation means to us. It's a mix of apartheid, martial law, and Jim Crow. The situation's impossible for Palestinians. There has to be some form of economic sanctions alongside all the organizing that we're doing in the progressive movement, and so much more pressure on the Biden administration as well as Trump's. And the next comment I have is, and of course Sam can chime in on this because it involves the Zionization of South and Central America. We can't talk about what's happening on the border without recognizing the extraction business and the curse of the extraction business on the Arab communities and countries, as well as South and Central America with the lithium and us with the oil. So recognize that the corporations run the show as it relates to foreign policy, and how Israel plays a major role in what's happening in South and Central America with the militarization of the paramilitaries and the assassinations of climate justice activists, indigenous especially. I worked on Berta Cáceres' campaign and was very impacted on her work and how she advocated for her community. I just would like a little more elaboration on that from you, Ben, as well as Sam, if you can comment on that. I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Samia, before the responses, I just want to appreciate all the panelists who have joined us. I know Miss Elahe Amani would have to leave the room because she has another Zoom meeting that she needed to be on there. So I want to just take the time to appreciate everyone. If someone needs to drop off, we understand we've gone over the time, and we have another panel starting at 7. So we have a sharp end at 6:45. I'm sorry to interrupt, Samia, and you provided your questions here. So panelists, if you could respond.
Yeah, I'll respond first because I was addressed. The role of Israel in Latin America goes back many decades, and we should always understand that Israel is really an outpost for U.S. imperialism. Of course, Israel, well, began as an outpost for British colonialism. Of course, Palestine was colonized by the British, who, along with the French, carved up Western Asia in the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, and the British colonized Palestine, and then they, well before World War II, well before the Holocaust, they were already planning on colonizing Palestine and creating a Jewish state, and we saw that with the Balfour Declaration. So the horrible tragedy of the Holocaust, because of that history, it's now portrayed as if Israel was created because of the Holocaust, but actually the British were already colonizing Palestine and planning to create a colonial extension of British colonial power there. And the founding father of modern Zionism, Theodore Herzl, actually was in regular correspondence with Cecil Rhodes, the horrific British colonialist who has the blood of millions of Africans on his hand. He actually had an entire country named after him, Rhodesia, a British colony named after him. And Theodore Herzl, the founding father of Zionism, modern Zionism, was working with Cecil Rhodes. So Israel began as a British colonial project, and then after World War II, the US kind of gobbled up large parts of the British Empire. And specifically after 1967, that's the moment where, with the Six-Day War, in the beginning of the military occupation of the West Bank, Israel really becomes an extension of US power. And since then, in Latin America, we've seen that when the US wants to carry out a policy, but it can't do it directly, it relies on Israel to do it on behalf of Washington. So the classic example of this, a heinous historical example, is during the 1980s, here in Nicaragua, in fact, there was a contra-terrorist war that began with Jimmy Carter, and then it was really expanded by Ronald Reagan. And in some of these ghouls who are now overseeing the US Venezuela policy, including Elliot Abrams, a convicted war criminal, he and John Negroponte and others were overseeing a policy of this terror war, the Contra War in Nicaragua and in El Salvador. And there was also a similar genocidal policy of extermination targeting Marxist guerrillas and the indigenous Maya community in Guatemala. And what happened was, I mean, it's a complex historical example because it was very good to see that many progressives in the US were organizing against the contra-terrorist war. And there were Democrats who were actually supportive, and they voted in Congress to end official US support for the Contra death squads in Nicaragua. So what happened is that the Ronald Reagan administration just went to Israel, and Israel continued helping to support the Contra death squads in Nicaragua and El Salvador. That also infamously led to the Iran-Contra scandal, because Iran was involved as well. So it's a very complex history. But also Israel, around the same time, there was a military dictatorship under Efraín Ríos Montt in Guatemala, who was an extreme evangelical Christian, a fundamentalist, like Mike Pompeo. And of course, the main constituency for Zionism in the US these days is not even the Jewish community anymore, because so many, especially young Jewish Americans, are non-Zionist or anti-Zionist because they recognize that Israel is so far right. So the right-wing evangelical Christian community has become the main base. And in Latin America, Ríos Montt, the Guatemalan dictator, he oversaw a genocidal extermination campaign funded with millions of dollars per day from the US government. And Israel helped directly oversee that campaign along with the Reagan administration. And then fast forwarding to today.
Dan, we're running short of time. If you don't mind wrapping up in 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'll wrap up.
Thank you.
So fast forwarding to today, Israel, as an extension of the US, also does counterterrorism training. And I mentioned the role of evangelical Christianity. So this isn't there are evangelicals who are more progressive, but the right-wing evangelicals, this is something that is shared between the Trump administration with Mike Pompeo and Pence, and right-wing evangelical groups in Latin America who are also very largely pro-Israel. So, it's important to understand how all of these groups link, and what ties them together is right-wing ideology. So it's an important issue, and thanks for bringing that up, because it's not really well known, those links in Latin America.
Thank you very much, Ben. Any other panelists who want to address this question?
I want to address the BDS comment of Samia. So Samia, thank you for bringing that up. And, BDS is simply a non-violent way of resisting the occupation and holding Israel accountable. When the US government fails to hold Israel accountable and actually being complicit, it is up to all of us, people of conscience, people who are fighting for human rights, to have that voice and say, we will not invest our money, we will not invest in companies, we will not allow our universities and educational institutions to put money on occupied land. We will not encourage this state terrorism of land confiscation, killing children, demolishing houses, and this humiliation of Palestinian rights day in and day out. It's unfortunate that we have in the US here, we have some states passing legislation to make BDS illegal, and some of them even, you will not do business with companies. So we have a big fight ahead of us on the BDS movement, but it is simply a non-violent way of resisting the occupation and resisting Israel policies of suppression and of the Palestinians.
Thank you, Sam. Our last
So the final question, I believe, is from Melanie Liu regarding BDS and sanctions. I'm thinking maybe Elahe or Sam, if either of you wish to address her question about.
Yeah, Elahe unfortunately has left the room because she had another engagement that she had to be done. But Sam, if you don't mind, and I've unmuted Melanie if she wants to ask her specific question.
Hi, thank you for taking my question, and thank you so much to all the panelists. I'm wondering if we can agree that sanctions cause more harm than good, and that we cannot say it's not okay to sanction Iran, look at all the suffering. It's not okay to sanction Venezuela, look at all the suffering. But we should sanction Israel. And that's my only problem with BDS. I fully support using boycotts as a lever for change, I have participated in boycotts myself, many of them. Same for divestment. My question is about sanctions and the humanity of that tactic. Thank you.
Well, I mean, what I see different in the case of Israel is, unlike other countries that you have mentioned, they're not receiving the financial aid and the support, the unconditional aid, military aid and financial aid from the United States. Here you have, like I had mentioned earlier, we are spending $38 billion of aid to a country that continue to abuse human rights, continue to be an occupying power, and continue to be colonization power. We are trying to get the Israeli government to understand that this can no longer continue. You can no longer have a free reign on terrorizing the Palestinian population, stealing their land. I mean, what options as a Palestinian population have? We don't want, if we as people who do not want to see violent people, we want to have a peaceful resistance. This is one way of those. I don't see really what alternative, given the circumstances that the Palestinian population is under, given the favoritism and the one-handed dealing from the United States government. It's simply going to have to put leverage and allow the Europeans and other people and the people who have conscience here in the United States to influence the policies of the United States and hopefully to influence the policies of Israel, that you can no longer continue this. And we as a world community will not put up with this.
Yeah, and I'll jump in for 30 seconds here, and I'll say that when we're talking about BDS, it's with the understanding that the US government is never going to impose sanctions on Israel. But the goal is, I mean, BDS is a larger international movement. We know that the US government isn't going to, and the US government is the one that can hurt people with sanctions because it blocks countries from access to the financial system. So, but what we should have, I mean, we should support BDS 100% with the understanding that the goal for the US should be to end military assistance, because of course the US is not going to sanction its own allies, but the US can stop military support for this apartheid regime that is, I mean, it's not, by the way, the Human Rights Panel of the United Nations published a report 2 years ago saying that Israel is an apartheid regime. So that's something that even the United Nations has said. So BDS is the most important strategy that we have to pressure Israel, with the understanding that when we say BDS, it's mostly B and D, boycott and divestment. The sanctions part, it's not, we're not ever expecting the US government to impose sanctions on Israel. It's ending the military assistance.
Thank you so very much. Samia, I see your hand up. Is that a follow-up question you have, or you just forgot to lower your hand?
You have to unmute her.
Do you do that? You want to do
Oh, Samia, you muted yourself again. Oh, that's okay.
Sorry about that. You know, I want to add to the BDS argument. I mean, I'm an activist. I will tell you, as a Palestinian activist, if I go out and I advocate for BDS, there are serious consequences for Palestinian Americans. There are legal ramifications just for our constitutional right to even voice a protest or a boycott. Whereas if you look at any successful campaign, successful campaign, whether it be in immigrant, in the farming or civil rights, or much of the campaigns that have been, you've gained a lot of civil rights contributions vis-a-vis Martin Luther King or Cesar Chavez, they were boycotts. Palestinians come to say, let's boycott. And I agree, Marcy. I mean, academic boycott is a wonderful way of, and a very strong way of addressing the human rights violations that Israel carries on, because it carries on as its progressive democratic state, and it is furthest from the truth. So I just want to let you know, when you say sanctions, you can't see the humanity of it. Boycott, it's the reverse reaction to American Arabs and Muslims and those who are advocating for Palestinian human rights face a serious consequence. Hence, you have the unconstitutional moves that you see in Congress that advocate for punishments in any capacity to anybody that advocates for boycott. I just wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Thank you, Samia. It is 6:49. We are going to run into another panel, unfortunately, if you continue, but this is a conversation that must be ongoing. And so thank you for all of our guests. And Farah Marjan, if you have one last word to summarize this call, if you could lead us to the next panel, that would be really great.
Actually, Lauren is going to show the video from Representative Barbara Lee before we transition.
Yeah, I'll transition after the video, no problem.
Sure. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Congresswoman Barbara Lee, representing California's 13th Congressional District. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. For decades, I have fought to stop endless wars and shift resources decisively away from war making. We need to use our resources to fight poverty and to seek peaceful solutions at home and abroad. As we fight back a global pandemic, it's more important now than ever to stop putting military spending over the needs of people. In particular, we need to put our efforts toward addressing this public health crisis, which has killed over 160,000 people in our country, more than both the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's why I joined my colleagues in the House and the Senate to propose a 10% cut from this year's National Defense Authorization, with the intent for it to be used toward human needs at home and abroad. A 10% cut means $73.8 billion that could be spent on programs that will improve the quality of life for everyone. That's more than enough to make a difference. It's past time human needs come before bloated military spending. We invite you to join us in supporting this effort. Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who participated in this session on foreign policy and demilitarization. Special thanks to our panelists, Marcy Winograd, Elahe Amani, Sam Hindi, Ben Norton, and Bobby Nelson. So our next panel is going to be on the Green New Deal for local communities. And since I was asked to provide a transition between the two, I'll throw in this little curveball thought, which is that the ability of the US ruling class to extract super profits from controlling governments in the global South not only hurts the people in those countries, those super profits strengthen the ruling class's ability to push back on us here in the United States. And we see that with the Green New Deal, that the oil companies that are extracting resources from the global South then fund disinformation campaigns and buy off politicians here in the US. So our actions on foreign policy aren't just about altruism for others, but it's inextricably linked to the policies that we're able to enact here at home as well. So with that, we will take a short break and then reconvene at 7 p.m. with the Green New Deal panel.
Thank you, everybody.